We all know that the arts field has seen success in advocating for public support of the arts. Over the course of time, we've largely maintained public support at the local, state, and federal levels. And for the most part, we have grown that support modestly and incrementally. For more than 50 years, we have also defended public support of the arts, right? Being in a defensive posture all too often. But the question remains, have we adequately shifted our support from a frame of nicety and good to support to a frame of necessity and critical to support? You know, there's no need for a spoiler alert on this issue. We know we're not where we want to be. We also know that for the arts to strengthen our nation in all the ways the arts are uniquely positioned to do so, a more significant and appropriate level of public support is needed. And of course, the COVID crisis has dramatically added to this equation. As much as we are committed to public investments in the arts as a nonpartisan issue, others treat it as partisan, and that certainly impedes our greater success. We know the arts are not and should not be a partisan issue. We also know we enjoy support from our champions on both sides of the aisle, but with deeper and more committed support across the full political spectrum, we could surely set the stage for adequate resources for recovery and game-changing investments for the future. At NASA, we see the opportunity to create shifts in art support that are bigger than just influencing the current Congress. Building deeper political will for public investments in the arts across the entire political spectrum will be essential to secure any kind of significantly greater and sustainable support. To build this level of support, we'll need to appeal to more conservatives as well as additional moderates and progressives while we maintain the support of our current champions. And NASA is actively working long-term to accomplish this. Our journey has included, for example, commissioning a national GOP opinion poll about arts value and support. The poll helped us learn more about a part of the electorate we need to understand better. We also convened a bipartisan think tank to help us explore shifting our strategies. We learned from those efforts and other efforts, and we're improving our advocacy strategies as a result. Continuing this journey, we engaged in the research and development of new messaging strategies to help us garner deeper support more fully across the political spectrum. And so our goal, to be frank, is very, very simple. We want to motivate deeper and more meaningful public funding for arts and creativity. With the good folks at Metropolitan Group, we've published a narrative guide designed to help you make effective use of the new message framework. Admittedly, the guide is a bit dense. It's dense with great stuff, great work. And we know, the work in the new message framework is nuanced and it requires customization. That's why today is so important. This webinar is designed to help you make great use of the new guide. Big picture, we believe effective use of the new message frames will help us attract new advocates and build the capacity of all arts advocates to communicate more compellingly and more effectively across the entire political spectrum. We also believe the effective use of this new tool can help us drive the political expectation for arts and creativity as necessary investments for our country. That's where we're headed. And I'm glad you're on this journey heading there with us. And now I'm pleased to hand the virtual mic to Metropolitan Group's Rob Sassor to get us rolling.
Thank you so much, Pam. I am Rob Sassor with Metropolitan Group, coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, which is now known as Washington, D.C. And I am joined by our creative director, Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, who is based in Portland, Oregon, and who will introduce himself here later on in the program. Additionally, Eric Giles, as you know, is monitoring the chat to help layer questions into our conversation as the conversation continues. As the screen indicates, this is the second of these trainings, the first of which occurred on October 14th, and the link to which is included in your agenda today. The first training went into greater depth on the research backing for the resulting narrative and messaging, and a deeper conversation into the messaging itself. And the purpose of today's session is to provide that primer, which for some of you will be a second coat of paint on the original research and messaging, while also making space for you to try on the benefits messages yourself and to have conversation about what elements of that came easy to you and where you might need some additional support to take those messages forward, as well as to see those messages in practice. First, some quick housekeeping. This session, as you know, is being recorded so that it can serve as a standalone training for others who come into the fold over time. As such, please do make sure that your microphone is muted if you're not the one that's speaking. And we will be taking questions in the chat box throughout the course of the conversation, but we'll primarily be answering those questions through dialogue. And that serves two purposes. First, it helps to ensure that those who are not present today, but who take the training via the web in the future are still able to gain from that content. And secondly, it helps to ensure that we're not sharing content in two different places at once, which can be counterproductive for some learning styles. We do have 90 minutes together today, during which time you will have the chance to experience NASA's new advocacy messaging in a few different contexts. We will begin with that introduction of the new narrative and messaging, and then make space for you to try on the benefits messages with illustrative stories from the regions that you serve. And then Pam and Eric are going to demonstrate through a fishbowl exercise the key questions that NASA often hears in its advocacy work and sample responses to those questions that are grounded in this new narrative. You will see that there are two primary outlets for your questions to be addressed today. The first will occur during a clarifying question and answer session that will follow the research and messaging presentation. And then the second will come toward the end of today's session, immediately following the fishbowl, or actually integrated into that fishbowl exercise. We do welcome you to lay your questions into the chat as they come to you so that you're not sitting with a question and are able to sort of let it go. It will help Eric Giles know where to layer that question into our conversation if you label that question. So if it's a clarifying question that's about the research or the messaging itself, you're welcome to label that as just clarifying. And if it's a question that you get asked that you need help reframing in the context of this new narrative, if you just label that fishbowl, that'll help Eric know where to slot that into the conversation later on today. There will also be space for some discussion after the individual work time, where there may also be some space for a little Q&A as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to do a very quick background on that robust research that Pam alluded to that led to this message frame, and as well as a quick overview of the key findings that we think will help contextualize for you, especially what's new about this narrative. As Pam noted, there was the policy think tank that NASA conducted in 2018 that did result in a start point message framework that served as the initial seed for the work that we conducted in 2020. We picked that up in 2020, beginning with a robust research phase that included a literature scan and a discourse analysis. And we were really rooted to begin with on conservative values as they motivate public funding and public policy. So we were looking at the analysis of height, for example, and Lakoff, looking, as Pam said, at the 2017 GOP registered voter survey, as well as the work of think tanks like Pew, and then many articles that were both in favor of and contradictory to public funding for arts and creativity, in order to assess what are the underlying values of both of those argument sets. It was NASA also wanted to make sure that we were learning from insights beyond the arts and culture realm. Looking specifically at sectors that have effectively broadened the base for political support and shifted from predominantly progressive frames to pan-partisan frames, and in the process increasing public funding. So we specifically looked at the fields of clean energy, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and the National Science Foundation. And for those, we interviewed congressional staff, industry leaders, and advocates in order to understand the pivots that they created and the implications for NASA's work. If you're interested in just a little bit more detail about any of this research, I do invite you to go back to that October 14th, 2020 video that's linked in your agenda. I'm doing a very quick overview today. After the initial formative research, we then conducted message testing that was based on the draft narrative that we developed inspired by the formative research. And that message testing included an oversample of conservative members of Congress, their staff, and influencers. This included an appropriations staffer on the House side, as well as an appropriations staffer on the Senate side, a Republican mayor who successfully increased taxes to build out the creative infrastructure in his community. Arts advocates, including many of you here today, the chair of the NEA, one lobbyist with expertise in this space, as well as many elected officials and their staff. And all along the way, we were guided by the advisory group that NASA recruited to help guide this effort, with whom we shared what we were learning to make sense of that information together and to make refinements to the draft narrative guide that resulted in the final version that we're sharing today. So now I will touch on the key findings from both this formative research as well as the message testing phase. And the key finding coming out of the formative research is that when conservative policymakers make the case for public funding for arts and creativity, the concepts that they come back to are concepts of strength, whether or not they use that specific term. So they often speak to how arts and creativity help to build the fabric of communities and create places that people want to stay and raise their families. They speak to stemming the tide of the opioid addiction crisis in this nation, to helping returning veterans overcome PTSD and more. It's also worth noting that this framing of strength was validated in our research about other fields that have successfully broadened political support. And finally, what we were hearing, and this speaks to Pam's initial context setting, we were hearing from people early on in this research that leading from a place of strength is not only an opportunity in terms of messaging, but also an opportunity in terms of an advocacy stance. That rather than walking into the room and assuming defeat and asking, to just hold on to existing budgets or to mitigate cutbacks, which can be seen as weak advocacy positions, that there's a real opportunity to not only lead with messages of strength, but to embody those messages in how we advocate. The next piece is around innovation. This won't be a new concept to those of you who are involved in STEM to STEAM advocacy, although if there's time today, we can talk a little bit about some of the feedback that we were getting about how innovation was layered into those conversations and how we built out that concept in our message frame based on what we heard. But the concept of innovation and global competitiveness remains very salient, particularly in helping to create that pivot for clean energy and the National Science Foundation. And what we were learning from the formative research is that we wanted to test further in the message testing the implications for the arts and creativity field. There were 4 values that motivate public funding that rose to the top in our research that are relevant in an arts and creativity context. Those are strength, innovation, prosperity, and community. If you're wondering what we mean by values, the values are what your constituencies stand for and what motivates them to take action, and are therefore the concepts that need to be reinforced throughout your messaging, your imagery, as well as who you select as your messengers. One stereotype that's worth busting is the notion that political champions are predominantly progressive. NASA's own research has shown that arts funding does not neatly follow party lines. And our research validates that what NASA already knows to be true, which is that there are champions across the political spectrum. So that includes Tea Party conservatives like French Hill and Mike Huckabee, rank and file conservatives like Ken Calvert, Don Young, and G.T. Thompson, to moderates like Murkowski, Stefanik, and Capito, as well as progressives like Bonamici, Pingree, and Udall. So when we think about who the champions are, we need to be open to and fully engage the diverse spectrum of those who believe in our work. And when these people talk about arts and creativity, their rhetoric often comes back to the very tangible benefits that the field provides to people, communities, and the nation. And we'll get into what those are later on in our discussion today. So those were the formative findings that led to the development of a start point new advocacy narrative for NASA that we then took into that testing phase with elected officials, their staff, and influencers. What I'm going to share next is what we learned through those conversations. And the first of which is that the message frame, as initially drafted, did resonate with policymakers across the political spectrum and motivate public funding. And this is important to note because if you'll recall, our initial research was really grounded in the values drivers of conservative policymakers. And something we were very attuned to throughout this research was ensuring that we were continuing to hold the values drivers also of progressive policymakers and not craft something that just brought in new audiences, but might end up leaving other audiences that are current champions behind. And what we found through our research is that actually this new message frame does help to bring in new people while continuing to hold our existing champions. It's also worth noting that several people that we interviewed expressed interest in getting a copy of the message framework as soon as it was done. Many indicating that there were specific meetings that they were preparing for where they felt that this message framework would help them. And in some cases, this was members of Congress preparing to meet with other members of Congress or members of appropriations committees, et cetera. So we not only validated that these ideas were working for people, but in fact, there was a market built in for the resulting product. The first concept that we tested was this frame of strength. And it was experienced as new and additive to virtually everybody that we spoke with. And for many, it would give them pause. Sometimes they would ask, well, what do you mean by that? And because we were interviewing them, we would put that back on them and say, well, how would you articulate in your own words how arts and creativity strengthen our nation? And the way that they would fill in the blank was often with the tangible benefits that occurred later in the message frame, although they didn't know that they were coming up in the conversation. So what this showed us is that this concept, this frame of strength, was not only believable and resonates, but that policymakers are able to connect their own dots between that frame and the tangible benefits that they already believe. Many of you are already aware of Metropolitan Group and Arts Midwest's work together on the Creating Connection initiative. And that work helped to shift labels for our field from capital A arts and capital C culture to lowercase arts and creativity, which was a more inviting frame for the public, as our research showed through Creating Connection. Through this research, we looked at whether or not that framing was also more inviting for policymakers, and we did in fact find that it helps to expand the paradigm for the people who are served by this field. Time and again, the line that our interviewees would repeat back to us, sometimes more than once, is this idea that public funding is important to help ensure that it's not just big cities and places with wealth that benefit from arts and creativity, but that it's every town, including rural and small communities. This was a bell ringer message for progressives and conservatives alike, and it was a bell ringer message for policymakers who represent urban and rural areas alike. As a result, you'll see that we've lifted this idea into a couple of places in the message frame because it was important enough to say twice. We tested an array of these tangible benefits, and those that tested best are on your screen. The first was economic success and global competitiveness, and this frame will be familiar to many of you already. A second and very important tier of benefits are those of health and well-being, communities, and education. And what we're finding is that leading only with the economic success and global competitiveness benefits is not completing the picture for policymakers of the full realm of benefits that arts and creativity bring to communities. And my colleague Eric will speak to this in greater detail later in our conversation. We did look at whether there is any correlation across party line, for example, in terms of whether one or the other of these second tier benefits is the right one to lead on, depending on political party. We didn't see any sort of neat affiliation like that. So what this means is that to get prepared for any particular meeting, you will have to do what you always do, which is to customize the right priority and emphasis on these second tier benefits based on the policymakers whom you're engaging. The third tier benefit is beauty and grace. As one of the interviewees said, beauty is the icing on the cake, but what policymakers want to fund is the cake. Beauty does resonate for some policymakers in the context that while arts and creativity deliver these other benefits of economic success, health and well-being, communities, and more, that we also get the benefit of helping people to shape and express their own God-given talents, or to bring more beauty and grace into our lives and our communities. It does work for some. It's worth knowing before you walk into the room whether it's going to be the right message for your policymaker. And what we invite you to think about is whether that's the message that you should be conveying as the arts advocate, or whether it will be more credible coming from the Republican legislator from your community who's going to be going to the meeting with you, or the Chamber of Commerce business leader, or the former elected official who's from the Republican side of the aisle. And there are some tried and true messages that did test well, particularly this idea of just the leverage of public-private partnerships, or as my colleague Eric says, in our field, they're really more private-public partnerships because there's just so much leverage on the private side of things, as well as this piece around every federal dollar invested is leveraged with 9 in private funds. Those are very common arguments that we're already using in advocacy. What we're hearing from policymakers is that those are arguments for them for how arts and creativity represent good governance. And there are some elected officials for whom they do not already believe that arts and creativity is a field that should be a public investment. And if you don't believe that arts and creativity should be a public investment, just knowing that it would represent good governance is not enough to help somebody make that leap. And additional messages are needed to help close that gap to make the case that public funding is essential, and that not only is it important, but that also those funds will be used shrewdly. So my colleague Eric will help you understand how those two sets of ideas nest together in our message frame. The last thing that I'll touch on briefly is that just because of the nature, the timing of our research, COVID-19 and relief packages did come up routinely in our conversations. A number of elected officials did express concern about the well-being of artists, just given that, particularly performing artists, given the challenges of them performing in the context that they're accustomed to. So this message guide is meant to outlast this particular or any crisis, and you won't see COVID-19 layered throughout it. You will, however, on page 43, see a sample call to action that will help you prepare for a meeting if what you're asking for is additional arts and creativity funding in future COVID-19 relief packages. So that's the research at a glance, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Eric to introduce himself and ground us now in the message framework.
Thank you, Rob. So just as Rob did a really quick overview of the research, I'm going to do a really quick overview of the message framework because some of you on this call have already been in a workshop about the message framework, and our goal today is to present it for those of you that haven't been here, refresh it for those of you that that were here some months ago, and then to move into working with it. Everything in this message framework has come out of the formative research that said, what is it that people need to know to support public funding for arts and creativity, and to support much more robust public funding for arts and creativity. So this messaging is not messaging of what do you need to know to buy a subscription to the opera, or to buy tickets to the jazz festival, or to sign up for a painting class, where the experiential, the beauty and grace, the expanding your mind, etc. messaging may be more primary. This is messaging that's really focused on advocacy for public funding for arts and creativity. So just want to frame that because if you're looking at more, how do I engage audiences and communities, you can go and get the creating connection messaging that is different. It's not contradictory, but it is different because it has a different purpose and is aimed at different constituencies. So today we're really talking about advocacy messaging. With that, let's move forward really quickly because I know we're a little bit behind time. So today I'm going to go through and very quickly touch on the narrative. And the narrative is the big meta story. It's the core idea that we want to convey, that all of the messaging helps convey, and all of us live with narratives. Narratives are very powerful in our society, and narratives are made up of literally millions of stories we hear, and narratives are conveyed through the frameworks and the messaging that serve as architecture. I'm going to share with you the core message, the gestalt of what is it that takes all of the things that we've learned and puts it into one elevator pitch core idea message. We're going to share with you the benefits messages. Rob said that there were some primary benefits that really test well, and a secondary benefit that's worth being able to share. We're going to share a message around why public funding, and that's really critical. One of the things that we found in our research is that there is often in advocacy a skip over of the why public funding, or a justification of the public funding really focusing on the leverage and not making the case of why the public funding itself is needed. And finally, we'll do a very quick touch on calls to action, because those are really customized based upon each ask. So let's jump forward. The overarching narrative, the story that we're wanting people to get through all of this messaging is that arts and creativity strengthen our nation. This is this new focused frame on the idea of strengthening. And you'll see in every single benefit message, whether we're talking about economy or education or community or well-being, those are all different ways that we are strengthened as people, as families, as individual communities, as states, and as a nation as a whole. In general, this narrative is focused on strengthening the nation and our nation. We did test strengthening America versus strengthening our nation. Really important to note that with progressives, strengthening America with some progressives has some blowback. It feels a little bit too flag-waving and patriotic, and also raises concerns, particularly for immigrants from other parts of the Americas, about who is America. Whereas our nation resonated really well with progressives and equally with conservatives to using the words America. So you'll see that we use the word America and Americans in certain places, but we always try to frame first with our nation. From a standpoint of the core message, and again, the core message, if we can go to the next slide, the core message, and I'm not sure if you're seeing the core message on the screen, I'm not. Thank you. So the core message, this is the gestalt. This is the elevator pitch in terms of putting it all together. And it's that arts and creativity make us stronger as individuals, families, communities, states, and as a country. They are a backbone of innovation, prosperity, and thriving people and places. Public funding for the arts and creativity is a high return investment that benefits every American in every city, town, and rural community nationwide. So let's break this down if we can go to the next slide. The construction of this core message comes out of what we learned in the research. So talking about arts and creativity is a much more open door and resonates much better with policymakers across the spectrum than capital A, the arts, or arts and culture. We're not saying that you can never say the arts. We're not saying you can never say arts and culture, but your opening, your framing of the field, if you talk about arts and creativity, it opens the door to innovation. It opens the door to believability on strengthening economics as opposed to being a secondary nicety to that. It opens the door to thinking about creativity in education. It opens the door to people seeing this as being relevant in their own lives and not having had to go to Juilliard to appreciate it. Makes us stronger. We know that the strength frame, economic and otherwise, for individuals, families, and communities is a core priority for policymakers and is a very significant bell ringer for conservatives. It's from the language we heard our best advocates on the conservative side of the aisle using, but it resonates with progressives as well. We talk about communities, we talk about innovation and prosperity. One of the things that we saw over and over is one of the core value triggers for public support for the arts is prosperity as an important trigger. We also saw community and the idea of being connected to each other as a core trigger. And we saw one of the critical benefits that folks looked at was not just economic development, meaning the multiplier effect of how many people also go to a restaurant, but the idea, and this ties into the core strength frame, that we have to be globally competitive. And our innovation, our creativity is what makes us globally competitive. It's what makes us the creators. It's what makes us being able to come up with the next solution to the next problem, the next opportunity. And so we really need to get that construct of innovation in to connect with strength in terms of an economic strength for competitiveness and to connect with creativity. We talk about it being a high return investment. This frames the public funding in arts and creativity as public funding done right, as a smart investment, and heads off one of the immediate concerns that policymakers who question public funding around why shouldn't it be funded by philanthropy? Why shouldn't it be funded by the private sector? Why, if people want arts and culture, great, they should buy tickets. It immediately hits the idea that it's a high return investment. It opens the door to talking about the leverage, but critically, it benefits every American in every city, town, and rural community nationwide. We tested talking about it benefits everybody, it benefits every American. And if you leave out every city, town, and rural community, they do not automatically fill in that blank. And that's a critical blank to fill in, because the number one reason that folks are willing to move to saying, there's a place where public funding and particularly federal funding makes sense, is that without it, arts and creativity are experienced in the wealthiest cities with the biggest foundations and the biggest corporate headquarters, and not every place else. I get it. That makes sense about why there's a public good that we need to invest in. If we can move to the next slide. And I recognize that I'm going really fast because we are a little behind schedule, so we'll have time in the Q&A and for you to try this all on. So Rob talked about a series of benefits. I'm just going to run through these so you can hear them and experience them, but I'm not going to talk through each of them because you'll see the research Rob talked about is layered in each of these. So when we talk about economy, arts and creativity are an American economic engine. They provide people with a foundation for creativity, equipping an innovative workforce, generating new ideas in every field, and keeping our nation globally competitive. Arts and creativity strengthen economic health by creating jobs in multiple industries, driving tourism, and providing opportunities for young people. So you can see 5 or 6 ways that strength and innovation are woven through that, not just an economic multiplier. Health. Arts and creativity improve Americans' health and well-being. They are one of the most effective treatments for trauma, depression, and anxiety, including among our nation's veterans. Arts and creativity reduce our susceptibility to stress-related diseases, and arts therapies help forestall Alzheimer's and promote lifelong brain health while stemming the tide of the opioid crisis. These are picking the things that were the most resonant with policymakers and believable in terms of how art and creativity advances well-being and health. Let's move to the next benefits. Communities are a very important benefit to policymakers. From rural towns to big cities, arts and creativity strengthen the fabric of America's communities. They celebrate local culture, both cherished traditions and exciting new ideas, telling stories of people and places. Arts and creativity promote connection and cohesion, foster the entrepreneurial spirit communities need to thrive, and create the kinds of communities where young people want to build families. So again, very important, woven into communities is not just that they're good for communities, but that they strengthen communities and that they work both for those cherished traditions and for the new ideas. We heard that it was really important that people care about heritage and care about tradition, but they also care about new communities, the ideas that are coming forward, and new innovations. Let's move to the next benefit. Education. Also tested well as a critical secondary benefit. Arts and creativity strengthen education. They set young people up for success, close the achievement gap, and improve test scores. Arts and creativity unleash human potential, promoting cognitive development and readiness to learn at every age. And they develop an innovative, globally competitive workforce by adding the key ingredient of creativity to a STEAM education. Again, when we talk about education, we're weaving in this idea of strength and the idea of being globally competitive, as well as the idea of helping everybody succeed. And finally, we heard from policymakers across the spectrum that the idea of beauty and grace was really important. There were few for whom that was the reason they would say there should be public funding for arts and creativity, but they resonated well with the idea that arts and creativity is delivering these benefits, and on top of that, is also delivering this critical piece that makes life great. Arts and creativity inspire us and bring grace and beauty into our lives. They give us opportunities to share our creative gifts and experience the creativity of others. So that's the set of benefits messages that resonated the strongest with policymakers, and that we encourage. This language specifically has been tested and works. It is also really guidepost for you to put it in your own words and to tell your own stories that carry this set of ideas. From a standpoint of the why public funding, which is the next critical message, what we learned was we have to frame it in terms of who that investment is serving and connecting it again to the benefits. Public funding for arts and creativity is a high return investment in every town and rural community nationwide, not only in the biggest cities. It improves the lives of all Americans, equips an innovative workforce, and keeps us competitive globally. It is a great example of government done right that fuels public-private partnerships, leverages $9 in private funds for every public dollar invested, and puts tax dollars and decision-making authority into state and local hands. So you can see in the why public funding, we lead with the overall reason that public funding does something that private funding doesn't, which is ensuring the benefits for everyone, not just the biggest cities. We connect it to the benefits and the concept of strength and competitiveness, and we then finalize it with the public funding done right. The idea that it's leveraging other investment, and the idea that decision-making authority is in local and state hands. And then from a standpoint of the call to action frame, you'll have a specific call to action for each meeting that you do, but a general construct is arts and creativity strengthen our nation. We must increase our public investment in the many benefits to provide the people in our state and nationwide these benefits. And that's why I'm urging you to support the quadrupling of the NEA budget in this next package. So that's the core message framework done very, very rapidly. And I'm going to hand it Dr. Rob to facilitate some discussion.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm actually going to open the chat and create space for Eric Giles if there are some specific clarifying questions that have come up during our conversation that you'd like to bring to the floor.
Thanks, Rob. I have a couple of questions from Eileen Schreiner in Oregon. First one is or can the term strength be used synonymously with resilience in this messaging framework?
Let me jump in on that one. I would not recommend switching the word strength for the word resilience. So there are places, if you are having a conversation with the head of the Wellbeing Center at RAND, who leads their resilience network, you could talk about resilience. But the language policymakers were using was not resilience, it was strength. There are some communities who experience the framing of resilience as saying it's okay that you've experienced incredible inequity, but good thing you're resilient. So it is not synonymous, and it was not tested from a standpoint of proving to work. So I would not replace the two. That being said, we do know that there are many places where there are discussions taking place about resilience. And so if you are having a conversation with policymakers who are talking about how do we build resilience, you can definitely talk about how arts and creativity are one of the surest ways to build resilience. They are something that really strengthens our nation. Here's the way they build well-being resilience. Here's the way they build economic resilience, et cetera. So if they are leading with that, you can use this framework to justify how arts and creativity are advancing resilience. We would not recommend changing those words.
Rob, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, where the idea of resilience came up was very much in sort of an economic bucket, and it was often related to recovery post-COVID, for example. And so it's a much narrower frame than the idea of strength.
I have another question. While the word culture is used in some of your descriptors, it doesn't seem to rise to your word choice for high-level communications. Is there a reason why, or is that something that they should be aware of when discussing culture?
Eric, do you want to take that?
If you want me to. So I don't know who asked that question, but beautiful, careful observation. You nailed it. It's very intentional that culture is not being used at the high level of messaging. And hard for me as a guy who's an art historian and came out of advocacy in the cultural landscape. When people hear the framing culture, particularly policymakers, they have many different definitions for it. And there's a portion who frame it as elitist. And highbrow. There's a portion who see it as code for identity politics and cultures. It opens lots of different doors that close down the conversation. Once you get into the conversation and you are talking about arts organizations and cultural organizations, etc., that's great. We're not saying don't advocate for cultural organizations, don't talk about people, about lived cultures, etc. We're saying as at the high level of messaging, you get a much more open door when you talk about arts and creativity together as the construct for the field. People outside of arts and cultural professionals, when they hear arts and creativity, they see the folk music, they see the guitar maker, they see the weaver, they see Yo-Yo Ma, they see the need for professionally trained dancers. They get it. They see that the Historical Society and the Temescal Cultural Institute are a part of that. You're not excluding the construct of culture. And you can then talk about cultural organizations and lived cultures. But if you use that as your opening frame, you are walking into potential traps that you don't need to, and you're walking into narrower doorways where our goal in these advocacy conversations is to walk into a more open doorway where people can see and connect to the core values that we saw motivated policymakers to see the need to invest public funding in art and creativity. And that's why we were very intentional in making that choice and why we're recommending that choice. Again, the reason I'm glad you're all at this workshop is don't take this to mean you can't talk about culture or cultural organizations, but use it as a specific in a secondary, not as the way you frame your primary messaging.
Rob, anything to add?
No.
Great. I've got one more question here from Judah in Idaho. I'm going to go ahead and read her chat to kind of give you the framework for this. Here in Idaho, I think it is the case across the nation. The suicide rates, which were already high, has increased exponentially with the pandemic. We have kids as young as 5 in the hospital system for suicide attempts. Our state suicide hotline has started a public art mural project that is quite powerful. Is this something that we can include in potential health benefits?
Yeah. Judah, thank you so much for sharing that example. And you are one step ahead of us in terms of where we're going in today's agenda. So when you have the narrative and message guide in front of you, you'll see that there's the message that Eric read earlier, which has this component that's about arts and creativity are one of the most effective treatments for trauma, depression, and anxiety. And then there are these sub-messages that build out each of these concepts. The idea of this message framework is not that you'll just go into a meeting and say, say the big ideas, but rather that you'll really bring them to life with the examples from that elected officials' district. And to the extent that you can be specific and measurable and say this particular hospital or this particular hotline has been able to forestall the number of suicide attempts by some percent, to the extent that you can make something really measurable for people, it will both provide a really powerful story as well as some metrics that help to make real the power of arts, culture, and creativity.
One thing I would add is what was great with what you put in the chat is it was an example of the kind of framing that if you were sitting down with a policymaker and that policymaker you knew cared about that issue and was aware of that issue in your state, your framing of the problem of saying this is what's happening and kids as young as 5 years old are having this happen, and here's how this solution, here's how art and creativity is a part of advancing the well-being of people in our state and a part of addressing this critical need in terms of the fabric of our communities. Your framing of the problem also then connects to the framing of a solution that really keeps this in the necessity space as opposed to the nicety space. So beautifully done.
All right, any other questions or comments before we move on?
That's all I have, Rob.
All right. Well, Judah, you're taking us in the direction of storytelling, so let's follow your lead. The next step of our exercise today is to give you the opportunity for some individual work time. And my colleague Eric Giles is going to pop into the chat two things. One is the worksheet that you'll find at the back of the narrative and message guide, and specifically pages 47 and 48, which are the excerpts of the worksheet that are focused on the benefits messages, as well as a link to pages 8 and 9 of the narrative and message guide, which are the overview of those benefits messages. So you can have one or both at hand if you'd like, either for now or for the next time that you're preparing for a meeting. But the exercise that we would like you to do is to first identify a particular elected official that you would like to engage with this new narrative and messaging. And think about which are the benefits messages that are going to be most salient for them and connect most with the other policy priorities that they're waking up every morning trying to advance. And we encourage you to identify more than one benefit category if possible. And if economy is one of those categories that you've identified, when it comes to picking one to build out, we recommend picking out one that's different from the economy benefit, because that economy is already a benefit that we're already so familiar with as a community. We'd like you to then spend the remaining time doing, what Judith did a moment ago, which is to build out a sample story and or some illustrative data that can help make real those concepts in the context of the particular district that policymaker represents. So we're going to give you 6 minutes from now to work through that process. The prompts are on your screen. If there's any clarifying questions, pop them into the chat, and otherwise I will give you a 1-minute warning in 5 minutes time. This is your 1-minute warning. And if you'll finish the thought that you're working on now and put your pencils down, let's come back together again as a group. So we'd love to create some space for people to share the stories and illustrative data for their communities. And you can do so by including that story in the chat, but I'd actually love to hear your voices telling those stories as well. So you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom to indicate if you'd be willing to share with the group.
Tony is from Nevada is raising his hand.
Oh, good. Oh, there we go. And I see Faye as well and Julie. Let's start with Tony.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the time today and this content and information I will share. I've actually pulled much of it and used it for our pre-hearing for our legislative session. And I'm finding using it is becoming quite valuable. One of the challenges, stepping back just a bit, we had with bringing in our CARES Act fund as an example. We have to do what's called a work program to bring this funding into our budget. And that's something that we thought would have been pretty straightforward and easy to bring in. But we actually had 3 legislators vote against us bringing that money in. And they happen to be from the conservative side of the aisle as well as from our rural communities. And so it really struck a chord with me on how we could better communicate with them on the values that we provide and the impact that we have. And so this language has been really great in regards to that. And what I did is I included it in our pre-hearing. I'd like to take credit that the fact that the presentation was so great that they didn't ask us to present anymore, and we believe have just moved our budget forward. I don't know that I can take credit for that. I think I need to, give you all credit for the language in regards to that. But I will tell you one thing we are doing as a follow-up on this is I'm creating some impact sheets for every single member of the committee that's reviewing our budget that highlights the grant work that we did. And in addition, it gives some stories of impact. And so from the education component of strengthening education and set young people up for success, for District 23, which is again a rural district in Boulder City, kind of the area near it's District 36. I apologize. It's in Pahrump. I highlighted one of our Arts Residency Express grants that we get that highlighted from the grantees' own words in response to the annual report that they give to us, the impact that the grant had in regards to the education component of the work that we were able to help fund. So I think that it was a great example of how we're kind of making those connections really felt at a district level.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that early indicator of success. And keep us updated along the way.
Will do.
Faye, I think you were up next, and then GP.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hi, everybody. So mine is a little bit more specific. I thought I would get like a real sort of grassroots kind of story. So we have a new governor. Our governor was named Secretary of Commerce, so she's gone. And our new governor was former lieutenant governor. He was very focused on the business community and education, although arts has been one of his focus areas. But we do have a new subcommittee on oversight for arts, hospitality, and tourism. So we recently did a presentation for them. And one of the things we pointed out is that over the years, the tax credits for filming here in Rhode Island have been greatly reduced and continue to be reduced every year. And we happen to have a very major HBO series that is filming in Newport. And because of the tax credits being so reduced, we had to split it with New York. So we pointed out that if we had enough tax credits, they would have done the entire series in Rhode Island. It's already contracted for 2 seasons, and there'll likely be more. And so as a result, locally, the community was hurt because we know that $1 every spent on the tax credit brings in $8 in economic impact. And this production will be seen worldwide and will be very popular. And we could have really leveraged that to bring a lot of attention to Newport. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Faye. GP?
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Rob. So my target, I guess, for this exercise is our own congressman who represents our office location, my hometown, and side note, I'm also the mayor of this town, and who has proposed on multiple occasions clawing back funding from the NEA and relief packages. And who also has yet to respond to my emails. So, the economic argument works really well, typically in those cases, but I will pivot a little bit to the community angle, and I will mirror the same talking points that our State House representative from this area says whenever he is given the opportunity to talk about the impact of the arts. And it's the same argument that I make in cases of supporting the arts in our own municipal budget, that the arts arts obviously have an economic impact, but they also help develop a sense of community and identity. We built the first set for the very first show ever done at our little art center in what is now one of our best restaurants in town. The restaurant was vacant. We built the sets in the restaurant on Main Street and put them on a truck and carted them a block to the art center. The art center was owned and operated by the city. The city poured money into that for a number of years with the intent of making it an economic engine. But aside from that place is now obviously a restaurant, but aside from that economic impact, you also had 2 of my friends become engaged on that stage. You had 3 of us buy our first homes in this area because of our connection with that art center. You had a family who had twin boys who had, and it's a small town, so everyone knows everybody, who had sort of not liked the city for a long period of time, come back into the city and be engaged for the first time in about a decade. And you had a place where local longtime residents were able to help support the community and see their grandkids perform, see their families come and visit. So what the arts do is they help create that sense of community, not just outside of the stage, but literally on the stage as well. And that's where you get a lot of that strong tie to the community, and that's echoed across the communities within this congressman's district. And I can point to millions of examples of that across our state as well. And so when you hear our state representative tell this story, he talks about knowing people who went to high school. It's an old high school building, went to high school there, who went to elementary school there, who taught at which classroom on which floor, and connecting the place to the community really has a good emotional tie. And that's another element that we use. It also, though, provides justification for the fact that this city funds the arts. Our state overwhelmingly funds the arts with bipartisan support. And we always like to encourage our federal representatives to echo the sentiment that the elected officials back home have.
That's beautiful. Love to know how that works. And I was often in our interviews pleasantly surprised at how important this idea of social cohesion was, and how these arguments that you're describing, just in terms of helping to increase engagement and participation in ways that can benefit the community and benefit our politics as a nation in different ways, often came up in ways that felt very natural to policymakers. So I'll be curious to hear if this resonates also with the policymaker that you engage.
Oh, I don't know if Pam knows which one I'm talking about, but based on her nods, I think she might. And we'll see how it goes. But I will say thank you to you all for doing this. It's something that I have really always wanted to have a conversation around. I run the South Carolina Arts Alliance, and we do all the advocacy work for our state. And this is a case we make all of the time to any brand of politician that ever gets elected. And it's really great to see us focusing on it on a national level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, GP.
Just before we jump to the next one, I just wanted to say that the way you framed your messaging takes the communities, arts and culture strengthens communities. And in the message guide, it talks about cherished traditions, telling stories, creating social cohesion, fostering an entrepreneurial spirit, and being the kind of place that people want to come back to and stay in to bring up their families. And the story that you told, you said hit every single one of those points by talking about specific examples in your community rather than using the language that was in the message. So that's just a textbook perfect example of what we mean by saying, take the core idea of the message and then tell it in a story that's relevant to play. So I just wanted to shout out for that, and not just saying, hey, you did a good job, but also saying, this is a great example of taking the idea in the message and saying the same thing, but making it more powerful by using a story that of course triggers all those values we're talking about. So just thank you for that. And this is another, and you'll see in the message guide, there's an example of a story in each one, but an invitation to say, hey, if you have a story, share it with Pam and her team, so that as this message guide gets updated, we can have relevant stories. So love that you shared that story. Thank you. And I think Julie was going next.
I do see my dear friend Julie. Hello, Julie.
Hello, I guess I have to unmute. I did this a little bit differently because we have a new congressman, and he is from a district that is more conservative. And so I just kind of wrote out what I would be saying to him as a practice if I were to meet with him. So this is kind of my spiel. So Representative Benz, congratulations on your November election to the House. As an Oregonian and National Assembly of State Arts Agency board member, I look forward to our chat today and having the opportunity to work with you and your staff in the future. The size and breadth of your district, the 7th largest in the nation, I know, is very impressive and perhaps daunting. As a former chair of the Arts Commission and a huge fan of our Arts Builds community program, I'm aware of the amazing breadth of creativity in your vast district. The strength of community building that takes place all over District 2 through the creativity of individuals and groups is impressive. Yes, there are economic assets, but they also represent innovation in our state. If you don't mind, I'd like to share a few stories of creativity and community in your district. Perhaps you know of them, and if you do, I hope you're very proud. In the most recent funding cycle of our Arts Builds Communities program, there are programs from Pendleton to Bend and Elkton to LeGrand, and that are transformative to our communities. For example, in Vail, COVID has isolated the community members. A joint project of high school youth, artists, community activists, volunteers, and the city's mayor will enrich the city's streetscape with public art. Sectors of Vale's communities are working together for health and welfare of the entire community. Indeed, arts and creativity can create community. In Bend, an outreach program is being funded that will bring live music to students in Latino communities and seniors in assisted living. Again, health and well-being of the community members is being addressed through creativity. In Elkton, a grassroots art and economic development initiative is creating a recycling infrastructure to their community that has lost public services. Multi-generational workshops are making it possible to create art from the recycled materials. Again, the health of the community is being addressed through the creativity of the community. If I had time, I could share stories for hours about how your second district creativity is truly not only an economic engine, but has positive ramifications for your communities, education, and health. But I do realize our time is limited and appreciate being able to sit down with you. As a congressman, I believe it's important for you to know that programs like these are providing education, improving health and well-being, and honestly, inspiring our citizens. The breadth and depth of creativity and how it is truly an engine to our economy is real. And these programs are examples of Oregon, and they take place everywhere across the nation. If you're okay with it, I'd love to keep you apprised as to projects in your district in particular that are making a difference in our communities and in the entire state of Oregon. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to our next meeting.
That was a masterclass. Thank you, Julie. I love how effortlessly you tie together education, health, communities, and also economy. And then had that dusting at the very end, which was that sort of the layer of icing that we talked about of the beauty and grace. It was just that note that you added toward the very end around helping to inspire people. It was beautiful and heartfelt, and thank you so much for sharing that.
And I hope I get to use it soon if we can ever do this in person.
Let's make that a priority. So we just have a couple minutes left on this section. I did want to check in with people. Were there any of these benefits messages that as you were crafting your own, you struggled with? Because it'd be helpful for us to know that as well. Go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to share any benefits that you struggled with. Seeing none, there might be other elements of the message frame beyond the benefits messages where you're thinking this is the place where I'm really struggling with these ideas and how I would make them real in my own meetings. So that's an example of the kind of fishbowl question that we are hoping to answer in this next part of our conversation. So if you do have a question like that, please do go ahead and pop that into the chat. I do see that before we make that transition, we do have a question from Judah.
Hi, everyone. So I told the story about the suicide rate and the effects that we've seen from COVID. And I'm just wondering, with NASA being sort of the data experts, is there work being done around measuring that? I'm still really familiarizing myself with the Creative Vitality Index and the AIP calculator and pulling things from different data sets. But as far as the like community health and well-being, because as I find talking to officials, it is they speak in numbers and they speak in dollars. And if you guys have any suggestions on how to make a better story that can factor in some of that data. Did the question make sense?
It does make sense. It's a really big question.
Yeah.
I can tell you, we don't necessarily have that data at our fingertips, but I
Yeah.
know it exists, and we may be able to do some marshaling, some pulling together of some references or links to
That
help
would be
guide you to
great.
some of the bigger data sets. So we have got that down, and let us
Thank
see
you,
what we can
Pam.
find for you.
Okay, thank
Absolutely.
you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Or for everyone, for you and everyone else. All right.
Well, with no further ado, yes, I'll hand it over to you, Pam and Eric.
All right. Well, dear friends, at this point, you might be wondering, where does the rubber meet the road, right? When the conversations get tough, right? How will this new message framework actually work when I'm face to face or maybe screen to screen with an elected official who's really questioning public support? Really questioning it. We've been there, right? As we've advocated. And so let's find out with Eric, and let's put this new framework to that test. And I'm going to use a few questions that I've heard, and I'm betting you have heard in advocacy. You know, as we advocate, those kinds of either questions or comments that are really tough to provide a compelling response to. All right, so we'll connect the new framework to some of the things I think we've all heard. So, and let's start with the idea of the nicety versus necessity, right? Nice to fund, but is it necessary to fund, right? You've heard this before. Let me do the first. I'm going to do the first 5 words and then stop. And if you've been there before, send us a signal. I love the arts, but, right? You've heard that. So here it is, Eric. I love the arts, but with important needs like healthcare access, meeting basic needs of the people, like food security for families, I just don't see how we can fund the arts. I'm for the arts, but we have other important needs that we really need to fund.
You know, Pam, I'm so glad that you just put it out there like that. I think you and I agree that the role of our government funding is to really make sure that we're meeting the needs of our communities and the needs of people. And we know that arts and creativity strengthen every single aspect of our community, from driving the innovation that benefits every aspect of our economy, is ensuring that jobs are growing in our community and that we are strengthening families' ability to fund what they need, to increasing the health and well-being and closing the achievement gap in our schools. These are all the things that we look at as critical issues here in our state, and I know that you have fought for in your district. And every single one of those priorities is advanced by arts and creativity as one of the highest returns on public investment. So when we're looking at the fact that we've got real challenges in our schools, we need to close the achievement gap. We need to make sure that our students are doing well on the test scores, and the resources that are coming from the federal dollars are getting leveraged 9-to-1 on that, and are one of the most proven and effective methods. We know right now, as we're coming out of this COVID recovery, you've been a champion about making sure we're paying attention to the mental health needs of people in communities. And we know one of the most effective ways to address trauma, which is what our entire nation and community have gone through, is through arts and creativity. So I'm with you on this. I think the question isn't, can we afford to invest in arts and creativity? The question is, can we afford not to?
Thank you, Eric. All right, let's try a few more. And so again, to all my friends out here, the next idea that I'd like to test in this way is the idea of strength, right? It's the newer idea we're placing into the advocacy messaging strategy toolbox, right? And you may be wondering about how that is going to work when the questions get tough or the conversations get tough. So here goes. All right, so to Eric again. You know, I really don't think of art in the context of strength. I mean, when I think of strength, I think of strong businesses. I think of a strong military. Are you really suggesting that the arts strengthen America?
You know, Pam, I am suggesting that arts strengthen America, and I deeply, deeply believe that arts and creativity do. Now, of course, I also think of the military, and I also think of our incredible businesses here in your town and mine as being really critical parts of strengthening this country. And that's why when I look at how important creativity is as a driver of innovation, which makes our businesses able to compete on not only a national basis, but on a global basis. I know how much the vets in our community value the arts program that had proven so effective at improving their well-being when they return home from conflict zones, which is a part of the strength of our military, is we never leave anyone behind. Those that have sacrificed for our country get support. And separate from the military, separate from the business community, two important pillars of strength in our community, the rest of our community needs strength too. We need strength in our education to make sure that no child is assumed to be a part of a victim of the achievement gap. We need strength in our communities to make sure that young families want to stay here and bring their kids up, and that someone who wants to start a business and be a job builder wants to do so right here. There are so many places where arts strengthen our community. And you and I know we're coming out of this COVID pandemic, and we've got a downtown that is empty. We need to enliven those streets. We have neighborhoods that have suffered. Nothing is going to strengthen our community more than relying upon the arts and culture and creativity of our community to re-enliven those streets, as we've already seen happening with the pop-up concerts that are starting to bring folks to the food carts again. So if you ask me, do I really believe that arts and creativity strengthen our nation? I don't think there's anything that makes us stronger. And that's true in the military, that's true in business, that's true in education. That's what our community strength is all about.
Wow, thank you. Eric, I'm just going to say, I knew I was happy we were recording this segment, and now I'm especially happy because you really helped me visualize the weaving of strength across the benefits areas in a powerful way. So thank you. Thank you. All right, and to everyone, I am gonna go back to an argument or an issue area that I know you've heard when you've advocated, and it's about the idea of public funding versus private funding. We've gotten that. In fact, we got that question a lot. It resurged in a big way in 2017 and rears its head all too often. So Eric, with money from foundations and corporations and ticket sales, the arts really don't need federal funding. The private sector can handle that. Why should taxpayers fund something that the private sector can fund?
Well, Pam, I really think the reason for it is because public funding is such a high return investment that improves people's lives and strengthens communities in every community, in every small town, in every rural area, not just in the biggest cities where the corporations are headquartered and where you have the largest foundations. We know that the public investment that happens in the arts equips every community to be able to build an innovative and creative workforce that is going to be an important driver for their economy. We know that every community needs to have the achievement gap closed in their schools. And we know that you're not wrong. There is private investment, which is why it's so important that we put that federal money in, because for every dollar we're putting in, we're leveraging it 9 to 1 in terms of the resources that come from the philanthropic and the private sector. So the question isn't should we or shouldn't we invest taxpayer dollars? The question is, there's a unique role that taxpayer dollars play in sparking innovation across our community, and there's a unique role they play in making sure that every community in the country benefits, not just those that have the most resources. That's why we put tax money in. That's the role of arts funding, and it's a great example of government done right, because not only do we leverage those dollars, but we keep most of that decision making in local communities and with the states who know what their communities need and how to best leverage those dollars.
Thanks, Eric. And I think we have time for one more, just really quickly.
Okay, one more.
One more. All right. And for our entire audience, I'm going to hit on the topic of innovation and economic growth. I think that in our advocacy, we've had a tough time really connecting the dots between the arts being so critical to innovation. We say it, but we don't. We haven't been as convincing as we could be. So that's why I'm going to hit this topic. All right, Eric. I keep hearing about the arts driving innovation, driving economic growth. While there are certainly some people who make a living in orchestras, I'm not seeing how the funding can really compete with funding, let's say, the tech research and other kinds of job drivers that are really about innovation. I just don't see the arts there. I see it in tech research and how they connect to innovation, but I don't see how you do.
Pam, I think you and I both see how creative expression is a real driver for innovation. And let's talk about that in virtually every industry right here in our district. We happen to have one of our largest employers is one of the largest plumbing fixture companies in the world. And, we're blessed to have Kohler manufacturing here, but we know that they are seeking out people who are their designers, their brand managers, their market strategists, but they don't stop there. They also see their competitive edge as how they manage the production floor and how they are coming up with innovative ways to manufacture and cost-effective ways to reduce expenses. So that's why they have an artist in residency program on their factory floor, and why for every job, whether you're working on the line or working in their design shop, they ask about people's creative work outside of work, because they know that's what makes them competitive. But it's not just about manufacturing. We also know one of the largest growth areas in our district is around content development. During COVID, before COVID, we were seeing an explosion of the need for content. It's continued during COVID. Just in the last year, 6 different studios have opened in our community. And who are they hiring? They're hiring writers, they're hiring illustrators, they're hiring animators, they're hiring videographers. All of those fields are why we need creativity and arts to foster innovation. And I can't remember if you were at the Chamber of Commerce lunch last week. It was virtual, of course, as it always is now. But I was blown away when the founder of Veneer Software got up and shared how their entire programming team has creative backgrounds, and how they seek people out with creative backgrounds for every position, because they're the ones that come up with the new solutions to problems. So as you and I are seeking to strengthen our community, and as a business owner who's an advocate for arts and creativity in our community, we know that arts are one of the key drivers to innovation, which is why we need to invest in it.
Well done. Thank you so very much. Thank you. As it's time to close, I want to thank Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, Rob Sassor, and the team at Metropolitan Group for their work, for their expertise. They're really grounding us in strategy that's actionable, and they're helping us to strengthen the power of our own voices. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks as well to the NASA staff, who, especially those team members who participated in this work in particular, really helping to improve it along the way. Thanks so much. We owe a great debt of gratitude to folks from across the political spectrum: elected officials, appointed officials, influencers, advocates, and experts from inside the arts and well beyond the arts world, for their guidance and their counsel along the way in this project. They participated. They provided tough love when it was necessary, and I believe they helped us create a guide that will move our advocacy practices forward. And thanks to each of you, because you're really going to make this count as you use the guide to motivate deeper and more meaningful public funding for arts and creativity. So thank you for the work you've engaged in, for being here today, and the work to come.